I'm just fortunate to be the executive director of the Anti-Poverty Network of New Jersey, but there are many wonderfully diverse people who had an impact and helped create this report and the work that is happening now as well. And you'll hear from a couple of them on the panel in a little bit. So I also wanted to say to Richard Rothstein, my family, if we were people of color, probably would have been homeless at some point in my childhood because we grew up in housing that my grandfather helped build as a carpenter after World War II. And it was well known that it was only for whites. Even into the 70s and 80s when we were there, it was very exclusionary. And so I'm certain that at some point we would have been homeless if we hadn't been fortunate enough to have that low rent housing available to us. So as you might guess, the Anti-Poverty Network of New Jersey is anti-poverty. Our mission boils down to preventing, reducing, and ending poverty in New Jersey. We're a membership organization that then welcomes organizations and individuals, very diverse network of people and organizations who are interested in solving issues of poverty in our state. So last September, we released The Uncomfortable Truth, Racism, Injustice, and Poverty in New Jersey. We make the unapologetic claim that racism is a primary cause of poverty in our state. We also include about 100 solutions for how we can end structural racism and poverty in New Jersey. And I believe, if you haven't already downloaded the app, the full report, the PDF of the report, and the summary, 12-page summary of recommendations are there, so you can access them. You can also access them on antipovertynetwork.org as well under the Our Work tab. The report focuses on 6 broad policy areas: housing, children and youth, economic justice, health, criminal justice, and legal and civil protections. The wonderfully diverse group of policy experts and advocates that I mentioned who did extensive research, had long and thoughtful discussions, and created this report were clear that the report itself was just one step in a long marathon to end racist policies and practices in New Jersey. It's meant to serve as a basis for advocacy and the necessary action to bring real and sustainable change. So in creating the report, we needed to create a definition of what we meant by structural racism. So it's not intentional preferential treatment of one group over another or person over another, not prejudice or expressions of overt racism. It is disparate access to opportunity that's embedded in the social structures and a result of historical conscious and unintentional policies, decisions, and programs. Structural racism's most salient feature is not in motivation, but in the consequences we can see for people of color. When opportunity is not equal, and when people of color are 3 to 4 times more likely to face poverty, racism is at play. Structural racism is those things that are deeply embedded in our systems, that are just the way we've always done things. We don't recognize them as structural racism unless we stop to examine and learn more. Here I'm speaking to the white people in the room, because I'm sure for people of color, structural racism is evident. As I mentioned, it was a long process to create the report. We started with inviting community partners in to have conversations in February of 2015. We had a working group convene. We did a training with a group called Beyond Diversity Experts who helped us to kind of become in touch with our own biases coming into the conversations that we were going to have. We divided into 6 work groups, and then in the summer of 2015 we held listening sessions, and then the work group met, the steering committee met over some period of time for a little over 2 years until the release in September of 2017. So what we found, historical forces and specifically policy decisions at the federal, state, and local levels have directly shaped the realities of disparate and persistent poverty evidenced in New Jersey's population today. These developments and policies include housing policies, immigration policies, voting rights, school funding, health care programs, and many other factors. We also found that structural sources of persistent poverty reflect myriad limitations on access to opportunity, which have created 2 separate and unequal economic ladders. As Thaisa said, what may be the worst choice you or I could make might be the best choice available to someone else facing the barriers of structural racism and poverty. And third, New Jersey is not just one among all U.S. states facing these issues. Characteristics that are particular to New Jersey, especially the strength of home rule. Does everybody know what home rule is? So we have 565 municipalities in our state, and each town wants to control and not be kind of combined with other groups and other towns, right? And so we stay divided and we create segregation. Despite segregation, persistent poverty in New Jersey hurts the entire state by limiting the contributions of a large share of its residents. We have come to realize that if we provide a little bit of assistance up front, we can prevent more costly assistance and services down the road in our prison systems, our schools, our health systems, housing, and other areas of society. And lastly, these entrenched patterns of disempowerment can only be overcome through a movement of empowerment that both engages the most directly impacted in leadership and engages exclusionary communities and groups in ways that hold them accountable and fosters their cooperation and change to the benefit of all members of our society. So we identified 5 overarching recommendations that cut across those 6 different broad policy areas I mentioned. So addressing structural racism an explicit public priority for our state, requiring racial impact statements for all state legislation and rulemaking with potential disparate impacts. So earlier this year, Governor Christie signed into law a bill that would require racial and ethnic impact statements for criminal justice sentencing legislation, which was also a recommendation in the criminal justice section of the report. And this is for all legislation. So just like we require financial statements or fiscal impact statements for legislation before it's passed, we would require an analysis of the racial and ethnic impacts for people in our state. Require data collection and dissemination by race and ethnicity and socioeconomic status. So what we found throughout the report is that there are a number of areas where there isn't enough data collected to really show the racism. But like I said, we know it's there because we see it in the results. We also are advocating for the reinstitution of the Office of the Public Advocate, an independent Office of the Public Advocate with the power and resources to audit public agencies, having as a priority mandate the charge to evaluate policies or programs to perpetuate racial and gender disparity. And we also suggest reactivating the Commission on New Americans to integrate immigrants, protect their rights, and take steps to alleviate poverty. As the primary recommendation of the Corzine Blue Ribbon Panel on Immigrant Policy, the Commission on New Americans was created under the Public Advocate by executive order in January of 2010. It met for nearly a year, but without a public advocate, it ceased to function. We also recommend strengthening the Division of Civil Rights to file and prosecute systemic racism cases by removing current restrictions that require an individual plaintiff to demonstrate personal harm. I also wanted to touch on a couple of other issues that I think are pretty important, in addition to housing discrimination and segregation in our state. Certainly income, and these are a number of different recommendations, but I'm only going to touch on the minimum wage or livable wage. So one of the biggest barriers to self-sufficiency for many people in our state is the lack of a livable wage. There are many people working 1 or more part-time jobs who can't get a full-time job with benefits. And 9 of the 10 occupations that employ the most people in our state pay well below a living wage. The only occupation in that top 10 group are nurses that pay a living wage. And of the jobs lost during the Great Recession over 10 years ago, many of them were mid and high wage jobs. We didn't fully recover from the Great Recession in 2016. And a lot of the jobs that were replaced were more low wage jobs. So there are many more people struggling to get by and worse off than before the recession. So does anyone know what ALICE stands for? asset limited income constrained employee. That's a report that comes out of United Way of New Jersey. There's actually they're releasing some more data in Washington, D.C. tomorrow. But according to the most recent report, 37% of people in our state are either at or below the federal poverty line or working poor. That's more than a third of the people in our entire state who are struggling to get by and can't meet their basic needs all the time. 73% of single female-headed households in our state are either very low income or working poor. Single dads don't fare much better at 58%. I always say working poor are two words that should never be heard together in the richest nation in the world, nor one of the richest states in that nation. If you're working, you should be able to afford your basic needs for yourself and your family. We should not have parents eating every other day so that their children can eat, or seniors or people with disabilities deciding to buy food, getting needed medications, or paying their rent or mortgage. So without a livable wage, certainly that makes it much more difficult for people to afford housing when it is available. Another thing on the bottom here I wanted to touch on is our Work First New Jersey Temporary Assistance to Needy Families program. The benefit level that people below the federal poverty get has not been raised since 1987, 31 years ago. That's the year my family was leaving welfare in Camden County, and it wasn't enough to survive on then. It's now worth 50% of what it was back in 1987. I mean, I can't even fathom how people could survive on this benefit level, even with other assistance, right? And 31 years later, there are huge cost increases in housing, healthcare, food, childcare, transportation, and other basic needs. It's because of policies like the stagnant TANF benefit level, the family cap, which punishes families who are already on TANF and don't get any more money if another child is born, and work that pays poverty wages, that families cannot climb out of poverty in our state, and that we have 37% or more, because that's probably a conservative number, struggling in New Jersey. So as you can see, it's not all about housing, but housing is a large part of why so many are barely surviving. Income and housing are tied together to create great barriers that are almost impossible to overcome. We talk about people pulling themselves up by their bootstraps and living the American dream. How can people do that if they don't even have boots to begin with? So we have concentrated poverty. We are probably the third most segregated state in the nation right now. And this creates barriers and lack of opportunity for people in our municipalities. We released a report, I know Ashia Hayes is here from the John Watson Institute of Public Policy, and she worked on this report for APN. We released this in May of 2016, a report called The Cost of Poverty. It showed how we pushed people of color and other poor people into more urban areas all across our state, both big and small urban areas, including places like Bridgeton in Cumberland County, which is a more rural county, right? And these high poverty municipalities have lost their revenue base with corporations and other tax-paying businesses moving away. And many times they are stuck with eds and meds, the educational and medical institutions and hospitals in their municipalities who don't pay taxes, right? And so they're faced with this great need without the resources to do anything about it. Meanwhile, most of the time, there are neighboring municipalities who have the tax base and the resources, but not the need with our segregation, right? There are a number of reasons why we have such concentrated poverty, as we heard from Rich Frostein, but it all boils down to racism. So I wanted to touch just a little bit, and certainly maybe the panel might get into this in a little bit, on Mount Laurel. So who's familiar with the Mount Laurel Doctrine and some of these bullet points? Okay, so a lot of people. Okay, so I don't really have to go over this too much. Okay. But we are in a period where there have been really great settlements with about 200 municipalities, right? And so I just want to say that I think what's really critical going forward, and I think Richard Rothstein touched on this at the end, is making sure that as citizens, we're involved in these municipalities, whether we work there or have an interest there or live there, to make sure that these settlements and the housing that's built is implemented in the correct way, and that people who need housing, who haven't been able to gain access to housing, people in families, people of color, actually can gain access to the homes that are built. So this is a map from NewJersey.com, Steve Sterling, of Essex County and the area we're in now. Did everyone see the incredible Undesigned the Red Line exhibit up here in the back by Designing the Week? If you haven't, check it out before you leave. But it's a really awesome timeline to show you the redlining process, but also many other actions and decisions, policy decisions that have been made that have created the segregation that we have today. And if you take a look at the redlining map of this area and how it's currently segregated, so just if you can't see it, the blue areas are white folks, orange is black, purple is Hispanic, and then there's some like small green and gray areas of Asians and others, right? And if you look at both maps together, they're awfully similar to what our segregation is today. And then this is the Patterson area, the greater Patterson area. And again, if you look at the two maps together, of the redlining maps of the late 30s, with this one, you'll see a similar pattern. So we had many recommendations, like I said, in the report, but I just wanted to touch on a few of the housing recommendations in the report. There are a number of them. But as we heard from Richard Rothstein, the biggest source of wealth building in our country is home ownership. Or 37% of residents in New Jersey are renters. Many of them are people of color. 23% of renters have extremely low incomes. Historically, African Americans and other people of color have been denied access to home ownership, as we know. Last year, the Institute of Policy Studies released a report in September, I believe, that showed that the wealth of the median black household declined 75% between 1983 and 2013. The median wealth of Latino households declined 50% during that same time. They estimate that by the year 2024, whites will own 99 and 75 times the wealth of blacks and Latinos, respectively. This is unconscionable, right? And so we have to come together and look at some of the solutions that Richard Rothstein's proposed, that are in this report, and that others on the panel will talk about, to move the needle. Maybe have those uncomfortable conversations along the way, but we can't continue to brush these issues under the carpet and not do something, right? And some of these... So some of these solutions are really critical to doing that. One of the things that we recommend is a carrot and stick approach in terms of state and federal funding. So state funds and resources should be allocated in enhanced amounts to municipalities that promote inclusion and integration in our communities. Conversely, exclusionary communities and our segregated communities would get less state funding. The types of funding include school aid, road maintenance funding, and discretionary federal funds, as well as others. We also recommend that state and local consolidated plans and action plans must adopt policies that limit the allocation of community development, block grant, home, and other federal funds to governmental units that meaningfully and significantly affirmatively further fair housing in our state, right? So those funds should really be prioritized for those kinds of municipalities. Also, county and municipal governments and the state should be required to develop race-based inclusion and integration plans containing explicit, measurable, time-sensitive objectives to end exclusion, segregation, and environmental injustice as well. And these plans should be developed through open, public, diverse, and inclusive processes. We also must undertake an aggressive effort to combat foreclosure in our low-income communities across the state and communities of color. We should have state resources sufficient to achieve the goal for housing, counseling, mortgage modification programs, and other necessary actions. We also should aggressively enforce existing civil rights laws, and I talked earlier about strengthening the state division of civil rights to eliminate racial exclusion, segregation, and again, environmental injustice. It should include well-funded, prioritized litigation strategy centered on challenging municipally erected or maintained barriers to fair housing and integration, or zoning laws, right? And creatively maximize the use of existing legal protections to prevent the unnecessary eviction of low-income tenants. So, similar to what New York has been doing in guaranteeing legal protection to all renters facing eviction, right? We should have programs like that here in our state because most of the time renters do not have legal representation, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, I'm sure. So I also wanted to, before I end, say, Richard Rothstein said we don't have the political will to change things right now in a significant way. However, we need the people, as he was talking about with the social justice movements of the past, to put pressure on our leaders first. No significant change has come in our country without this. No significant or lasting change. We need the people who are directly impacted to be leading the way in this work as well. And if you don't already know about it, go to poorpeoplescampaign.org and sign up to get alerts, email alerts about what's happening in New Jersey, as well as 39 other states across the country and Washington, D.C. If you haven't heard, on Monday, we started our first action with civil disobedience, blocking off the intersection in front of the State House Annex in Trenton. 19 people were arrested for civil disobedience, and this will continue for 6 weeks to grow this movement and bring attention to the issues of systemic racism, poverty, the war economy, and ecological devastation. So I strongly encourage you to be involved. I've been involved for about 15 years with this movement, and glad to see that we are finally at this point where we have a critical mass of people in our country and in our state to call attention to these issues. We have about 1,400 people, I believe, signed up alone in New Jersey already, just since February. So I encourage you to get involved. And with that, I'll open it up. So,